The Andromeda sector had always been a delightfully predictable corner of the galaxy, where civilizations rose and fell with the boring regularity of a quantum metronome. Wars were fought according to established protocols, planets surrendered with proper paperwork, and the strong devoured the weak with all the enthusiasm of a bureaucrat processing tax returns. It was, by all accounts, a perfectly ordered nightmare of galactic proportions. At the apex of this cosmic food chain sat the Zephyrian Empire, a collection of 7-foot-tall crystalline-skinned beings, who had somehow convinced themselves that having naturally occurring armor plating made them the universe's gift to warfare. Their homeworld of Zephyros Prime resembled a massive geode that someone had decided to populate with the galaxy's most insufferably confident military strategists. Every surface gleamed with that particular shine that screamed, "We're better than you and our architecture knows." The Zephyrian military doctrine was refreshingly simple. Show up, flex those impressive crystalline muscles, deploy overwhelming technological superiority, and watch lesser species grovel appropriately. It had worked for roughly 3,000 years, which in galactic terms was about as long as it takes most civilizations to figure out that maybe, just maybe, arrogance might have some downsides. The Zephyrians, however, had apparently skipped that particular lesson in favor of building bigger ships and shinier weapons. Their current Supreme War Marshal, a particularly gleaming specimen whose crystalline formations jutted from his skull like a crown of cosmic smugness, stood aboard the flagship Inevitable Dominance. Yes, that was actually what they named their ship. The Zephyrians possessed many admirable qualities: tactical brilliance, technological innovation, and an almost artistic ability to coordinate fleet movements. Subtlety, however, was not among their strengths. "The final resistance coalition has gathered at the Helix Nebula," reported his aide, whose own crystalline structure was notably less impressive, marking him as either young or unfortunate in the genetic lottery. "Intelligence suggests they've managed to unite 17 different species in what they're calling a last stand for freedom." The aide's tone suggested he found this about as threatening as a strongly worded letter from a galactic ethics committee. The War Marshal examined the holographic display with the practiced eye of someone who had orchestrated approximately 400 final stands for freedom over his career. The Resistance fleet looked impressive enough, if you squinted and ignored the fact that their combined firepower roughly equaled what the Zephyrians considered appropriate for a minor border skirmish. 17 species, mused the War Marshal, his voice carrying that particular resonance that crystalline vocal cords produced, like wind chimes having an argument with a xylophone. How charmingly optimistic of them. Have we catalogued their capabilities? Of course so. The Verdanian tree folk with their organic ship hulls, picturesque but fragile. The Zaltonian collective minds, impressive coordination, terrible reflexes. The Prothean warrior clans, enthusiastic but hopelessly outdated weapons. The usual collection of desperate civilizations throwing outdated technology at an insurmountable problem. The War Marshal nodded with the satisfaction of a being who had never encountered a military problem that couldn't be solved by applying sufficient quantities of advanced weaponry. The Zephyrian approach to warfare was beautifully straightforward. Identify enemy weaknesses, exploit them with overwhelming force, accept surrender, file appropriate conquest paperwork. It was a system that had served them well across dozens of campaigns and hundreds of worlds. "Deploy the 7th, 9th, and 12th battle groups," he commanded, settling into his command throne with the casual confidence of someone ordering lunch. "Standard formation. I want this concluded before the next solar cycle." The Emperor is expecting a progress report, and you know how he gets when campaigns drag on unnecessarily. The bridge crew moved with practiced efficiency, their crystalline forms catching and reflecting the ship's lighting in patterns that would have been beautiful if not for the casual way they were discussing the annihilation of 17 different civilizations. The Zephyrian war machine was admittedly a marvel to behold. Their ships moved like schools of mechanical fish, their weapons discharged with precision that bordered on the artistic, and their tactical coordination was the sort of thing military academies across the galaxy used as examples of theoretical perfection. What made it all particularly insufferable was that they were actually as good as they thought they were. The Zephyrians had earned their arrogance through 3 millennia of uninterrupted victory. Their technology was genuinely superior, their tactics genuinely innovative, and their military machine genuinely unstoppable. They had defeated quantum-powered civilizations, outwitted hive-mind collectives, and systematically dismantled warrior cultures that had been perfecting the art of combat since before Zephyros Prime had achieved spaceflight. The Resistance Coalition waiting at the Helix Nebula represented everything the galaxy had left to throw at the Zephyrian expansion. 17 species, countless worlds, millions of ships, and the collective military wisdom of cultures spanning half the known galaxy. It was, by any reasonable measure, an impressive final effort. It was also, by any realistic assessment, completely doomed. The inevitable dominance and its accompanying battle groups began their approach to the nebula with all the urgency of a cosmic glacier. Why hurry toward yet another inevitable victory? The Zephyrians had time, superior technology, better training, and that most crucial of military advantages, the absolute certainty that they were going to win. After all, what could possibly go wrong? The universe, as it turns out, has a sense of humor roughly equivalent to a cosmic practical joker with a PhD in irony, and a minor in catastrophic timing. Just as the Zephyrian war machine was positioning itself for what promised to be the galaxy's most predictable military conclusion, reality decided to throw what could generously be called a curveball, and what the Zephyrians would later describe using language that would make a quantum sailor blush. The first sign that the universe was about to become significantly more interesting occurred exactly 17 minutes before the Zephyrian fleet reached optimal firing position. A small battered vessel of completely unknown design came tumbling out of what appeared to be a malfunctioning jump gate, trailing sparks, debris, and what looked suspiciously like the space equivalent of someone having a very bad day. The ship, if it could dignifiedly be called that, appeared to have been designed by someone who had heard spacecraft described second-hand by a drunk engineer with a grudge against aerodynamics. It was roughly cylindrical, covered in incomprehensible markings, and held together by what the Zephyrian sensors could only classify as optimism and structural prayer. Most disturbingly, it seemed to be running on some sort of controlled explosion system that their computers kept insisting couldn't possibly work. "Sir," announced the sensor operator, his crystalline features arranged in an expression of professional bewilderment, "we have an unknown vessel on collision course with planet Tertius. Design unknown, energy signature unknown, occupant species, also unknown." The war marshal turned from his tactical display with the look of someone whose perfectly choreographed dinner party had just been crashed by a feral alien, wearing a traffic cone as a hat. "Unknown? How can it be unknown? Our databases contain information on every spacefaring species in 17 galactic sectors." "Yes, sir. That's why it's particularly concerning." The mysterious vessel, apparently operated by someone with either tremendous skill or tremendous luck, managed to execute what could charitably be called a controlled crash landing on the contested planet below. The impact created a crater roughly the size of a small city, and sent up a mushroom cloud that briefly resembled what the Zephyrian cultural databases identified as an obscene gesture, though this was likely coincidental. Planet Tertius itself was one of those unfortunate worlds that had become a rallying point for the Resistance Coalition, strategically worthless but symbolically important. The sort of place where desperate species made their final stands, and military historians later wrote very sad chapters. The local defenders, a mixed group of various species, had been preparing for a valiant last-ditch defense that everyone knew would last approximately as long as it takes to say unconditional surrender in 17 different languages. The crash site became an immediate point of interest for both sides, though for entirely different reasons. The Resistance saw it as either reinforcements or a very dramatic distraction. The Zephyrians saw it as a minor inconvenience that would need to be catalogued, studied, and then efficiently destroyed according to standard first contact protocols. What emerged from the smoking wreckage was, by galactic standards, thoroughly unremarkable. Bipedal, roughly 6 feet tall, with that soft, squishy appearance that suggested evolution had decided to prioritize versatility over any single impressive trait. No natural armor, no obvious weapons, no crystalline formations or energy manipulation organ. The being appeared to be wearing some sort of primitive environmental suit and carried what looked like improvised tools. The first Resistance fighters to reach the crash site approached cautiously, weapons drawn but hopeful. The galaxy's last free alliance couldn't afford to be picky about potential allies, even ones that arrived via uncontrolled atmospheric entry. "Are you injured?" asked the Verdanian commander, his bark-like skin showing concern pattern. The crashed pilot was sitting on a piece of wreckage, apparently taking inventory of his situation with the calm acceptance of someone who had clearly not expected to survive the landing. "Well, let's see," the newcomer replied in surprisingly clear Galactic standard, though with an accent none of them could place. "My ship is scattered across 3 square kilometers. My navigation computer thinks I'm currently inside a star, and I'm apparently in the middle of what looks like a war zone, but I can still move everything that's supposed to move, so I'd call that a win." The pilot stood up, brushing debris from his environmental suit with the casual efficiency of someone accustomed to surviving various forms of transportation failure. Up close, his species' apparent ordinariness was even more pronounced. No claws, no fangs, no obvious sensory enhancement. Even his technology seemed primitive by Galactic standards. The environmental suit was clearly functional, but appeared to be held together by some sort of adhesive tape and what looked like creative problem-solving. "I'm sorry," continued the pilot, looking around at the assembled resistance fighters, "but I seem to have crashed into someone else's war. Mind if I ask which side is which? And more importantly, which side could use some help?" The Prothean warrior stepped forward, his scaled hide showing the ritual scars of his clan. "You offer aid to strangers, without knowing our cause or our chances of victory." The human, though none of them knew that term yet, shrugged with a gesture that somehow conveyed both fatalism and determination. "Well, from what I can see, you're outnumbered, outgunned, and making a last stand on a backwater planet. In my experience, that usually means you're the good guys. Plus, anyone who shoots at my landing site without asking questions first probably isn't the sort of neighbor I want running the galaxy." Above them, the Zephyrian fleet continued its methodical approach, their sensors now focused intently on the crash site. In the flagship's analysis chamber, xenobiological specialists were running every test their considerable technology could devise on the scattered wreckage and energy readings from the unknown vessel. "Preliminary assessment complete, sir," reported the chief analyst, his crystalline formations dimmed slightly in what passed for Zephyrian puzzlement. "The technology is primitive but functional. The energy source appears to be controlled chemical combustion, which shouldn't provide sufficient power for interstellar travel, but somehow does. The structural materials are crude but remarkably resilient. It's as if someone took Bronze Age metallurgy and convinced it to work in a space-age environment." The War Marshal studied the data with growing irritation. Unknown variables were like sand in the gears of perfect military planning. And the single biped, no apparent enhancements, no natural weapons or defenses, physically unremarkable by Galactic standards. However, the analyst paused, his formations flickering with uncertainty. "Sir, there's something unusual about the neural activity readings we captured during the crash sequence." "Elaborate." "Most species show either panic or resignation when facing imminent death. This one showed problem-solving activity. Even during atmospheric entry failure, the neural patterns suggest active solution seeking rather than fear response." The War Marshal dismissed this with a gesture that made his crystalline armor chime soft. One more species for the databases. One more minor curiosity to be catalogued and conquered. The galaxy was full of minor species with minor quirks. This one would be no different. After all, what possible difference could one primitive biped make against the most successful military machine in galactic history?
The universe has witnessed many David versus Goliath scenarios throughout its lengthy and frequently absurd history, but rarely had the setup been quite so mathematically insulting to the concept of fair odds. On one side, the Zephyrian Empire's finest battle groups, equipped with weapons that could crack planets, shields that laughed at quantum torpedoes, and tactical computers that had been programmed by civilizations that considered warfare an art form. On the other side, 17 desperate species, outdated equipment, and one confused biped who had arrived via what could generously be called aggressive lithobreaking. The battle began with all the ceremony the Zephyrians felt such occasions deserved, which was to say, none whatsoever. Why waste time on dramatic pronouncements when superior firepower could deliver the message more efficiently? The inevitable dominance opened fire with its primary cascade cannons, weapons designed to punch through planetary defense grids like a quantum-powered fist through tissue paper. The first volley struck the Resistance flagship, a converted Zaltonian mining vessel that had been optimistically upgraded with whatever weapons the Coalition could scrounge. By all rights, it should have been vaporized instant. Instead, it jinked sideways at the last microsecond.
executing a maneuver that violated several established principles of large ship physics. The cascade beam carved through empty space while the mining vessel spun like a drunken ballet dancer, somehow managing to fire its pathetically inadequate weapons at a Zephyrian destroyer's shield generators. "That's not supposed to be possible," muttered the War Marshal's tactical officer, his crystalline formations flickering in what passed for confusion among his species. "Mining vessels don't have that kind of maneuverability. Their inertial compensators can't handle those acceleration curves." On the planet's surface, the human pilot was having what could charitably be called a learning experience. He'd spent the last hour getting a crash course in galactic warfare from the Resistance commanders, absorbing tactical information with the focused intensity of someone whose survival depended on rapid skill acquisition. "So, let me understand this," he said, crouched behind an improvised barricade while Zephyrian fighters screamed overhead. "They always start with a standard formation, probe for weaknesses, then execute a systematic dismantling of your forces." "Essentially, yes," confirmed the Verdanian commander, his bark-like skin showing stress patterns. "It's devastatingly effective. Their tactical computers analyze our responses and adapt faster than we can compensate." The human was quiet for a moment, watching the aerial battle through a pair of salvaged binoculars. "That's their weakness right there," he said finally. "Excuse me? They're fighting the last war. Every war, actually. Same tactics, same responses, same assumptions." The human stood up, apparently unconcerned by the energy bolts zipping overhead. "In my experience, the best way to beat a superior force is to do something they've literally never seen before." What happened next would later be studied in military academies across the galaxy, though most would conclude the official records must contain significant error. The Resistance forces, following hastily transmitted instructions from their newest advisor, began executing maneuvers that made absolutely no tactical sense whatsoever. Ships that should have been retreating charged directly into Zephyrian formation. Vessels that should have been coordinating their attacks spread out across impossible distances. Ground forces that should have been establishing defensive positions scattered into seemingly random groups, some actually running toward the enemy landing site. The Zephyrian tactical computers, designed to predict and counter logical military responses, began experiencing what could diplomatically be called processing difficulty. Their algorithms had been programmed to handle every known form of warfare, from the ritualized combat of the Prothean clans to the quantum maze tactics of the Andromedans. They had not been programmed to handle an enemy that appeared to be actively trying to lose while somehow winning any. "Sir," reported the confused tactical officer, "their formation makes no sense. It's as if they're deliberately exposing their weaknesses while—" "Wait, that's not possible." The War Marshal leaned forward, his crystalline features reflecting the tactical display's increasingly chaotic light show. "What's not possible? They're using our own firing solutions against. Every time we target what appears to be a weakness, our shots are hitting their ships in places that somehow make them more effective, not less." On the surface, the human was coordinating what he cheerfully called aggressive stupidity via salvaged communication equipment. The Resistance fighters, despite their initial skepticism, were beginning to understand that their new advisor's apparent insanity was producing measurably positive results. "Mining ship Delta 7, I need you to ram that destroyer," he transmitted calmly. "Ram it? That will destroy us." "No, it won't. Their shield generators are overloaded from trying to compensate for your erratic movement patterns. Hit them at exactly 43 degrees from vertical, and their own deflector grid will cushion the impact while channeling all that energy back into their primary weapons system, which will then overload and take out their power core." The Zeltonian mining vessel, operated by beings whose collective consciousness was having serious doubts about this plan, executed the maneuver anyway. The collision occurred exactly as predicted, with the Zephyrian destroyer's own technological sophistication turning into an elaborate self-destruct sequence that would have been beautiful if it weren't so strategically devastating. In the space of 30 minutes, the Zephyrian battle formation went from textbook perfection to something resembling a three-dimensional puzzle that had been solved by someone who hadn't read the instructions. Ships found themselves firing on their own allies due to targeting computer glitches. Formation movements designed to maximize tactical advantage instead created gaps that resistance fighters exploited with increasingly confident precision. The war marshal watched his perfect battle plan disintegrating with the horrified fascination of someone witnessing a masterpiece of engineering being taken apart by a child with a hammer. "How is this possible?" he demanded. His aide, consulting multiple sensor readings simultaneously, wore an expression of crystalline bewilderment. "Sir, they appear to be fighting multiple battles simultaneously, each with completely different tactical framework. Our computers can't adapt because there's no consistent pattern to adapt to." What the Zephyrians didn't understand, what their entire military doctrine couldn't comprehend, was that they were no longer fighting a conventional war. They were fighting someone who approached combat the same way he'd apparently approached that emergency landing, by accepting that the situation was impossible, and then finding a way to make it work anyway. The human species, it turned out, had evolved on a planet where nothing ever worked the way it was supposed to, where survival depended on creative problem-solving under pressure, and where the ability to improvise solutions from inadequate resources was more valuable than having the best equipment. They were a species that had learned to thrive on chaos, and chaos, as the Zephyrian Empire was discovering, was a remarkably effective military strategy when deployed against opponents who had spent 3 millennia perfecting the art of predictable warfare. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in their imperial history, the Zephyrians were no longer certain of victory. Their perfect military machine was being systematically dismantled by an enemy that refused to follow the rules. The fall of an empire, historians would later note, rarely announces itself with dramatic fanfare. More often, it arrives wearing the humble work clothes of inevitability, carrying a toolbox full of consequences that someone really should have seen coming. The Zephyrian Empire's 3,000-year reign was ending not with the crash of colliding fleets, or the thunder of planetary bombardments, but with the quiet, persistent sound of everything they thought they knew being methodically proven wrong. The war marshal stood amid the wreckage of his tactical center, surrounded by displays showing impossible readings in computers that had apparently given up trying to make sense of reality. His crystalline armor, once a symbol of imperial invincibility, now reflected the chaotic light of a battle that had stopped following any recognizable rules approximately 2 hours ago. "Status report," he commanded, though his voice carried the hollow ring of someone who suspected the answer would involve words like catastrophic and unprecedented. "Sir," his aide began, consulting a datapad that seemed to be arguing with itself. "We've lost 60% of our battle group. The remainder are, well, they're not exactly retreating, but they're definitely somewhere else very quickly." The Resistance Coalition, meanwhile, was discovering that victory felt surprisingly similar to controlled chaos. Their improvised fleet hung in space like a collection of mismatched furniture that had somehow arranged itself into a coherent fighting force. Ships that shouldn't have been able to coordinate were moving in perfect harmony. Weapon systems that had been jury-rigged from mining equipment were performing with the precision of military-grade hardware. On the planet's surface, the human pilot was experiencing what he would later describe as the most educational afternoon of his life. The crash course in galactic warfare had evolved into something more resembling a postgraduate seminar in applied xenopsychology, with practical demonstrations in real-time tactical adaptation. "So that's how you defeat a technologically superior force," he mused, watching the last Zephyrian fighters retreat toward their crippled mothership. "You don't try to match their strengths. You make their strengths irrelevant." The Verdanian commander, his bark-like skin showing patterns that registered somewhere between awe and existential confusion, nodded slowly. "Your species must have faced many superior enemies to develop such tactics." "Actually, we mostly fought each other," the human replied with a shrug that somehow conveyed both pride and embarrassment. "Turns out that spending most of your evolutionary history in creative disagreement with members of your own species is excellent preparation for improvised warfare." The strategic implications were rippling outward through the galaxy faster than the news of the battle itself. The Zephyrian Empire hadn't just been defeated, it had been intellectually humiliated by a species that treated advanced military science like a particularly interesting puzzle. Word was spreading through communication networks, carried by refugee ships and intercepted transmissions,
that the galaxy's apex predators had been outmaneuvered by someone who had literally crashed into the war by accident. In the flagship's command center, the war marshal was coming to terms with a concept that Zephyrian military doctrine had never seriously considered: the possibility of genuine surprise. His species had spent millennia cataloging every known form of warfare, every tactical innovation, every strategic framework. They had built their empire on the foundation of absolute tactical superiority. They had never encountered an enemy that approached warfare as an exercise in creative problem-solving, rather than military science. "The unknown species," he said finally, his crystalline voice carrying the weight of dawning comprehension. "What do our xenobiological computers classify them as?" The aide consulted his increasingly rebellious datapad. "That's problematic, sir. Based on their technology, we'd classify them as a pre-industrial civilization. Based on their tactical capabilities, we'd classify them as a Class A strategic threat. Based on their problem-solving methodologies, our computers have requested additional processing power and possibly therapy." The human, meanwhile, was having a conversation that would reshape galactic politics for the next several centuries. The Resistance Coalition leaders had gathered around him with the focused attention of students who had just discovered their textbooks were incomplete. "The thing about superior technology," he explained, using a piece of Zephyrian wreckage to draw diagrams in the dirt, "is that it usually comes with superior assumptions. They built all this amazing equipment based on how they think warfare should work. But warfare doesn't care about it cares about what actually happens when your perfect plan meets someone else's desperate improvisation." The Prothean warrior leaned forward, his scarred features showing the kind of respect usually reserved for legendary battle leaders. "You speak of warfare as if it were in a sense, it is. It evolves, adapts, surprises you. The moment you think you've mastered it, it teaches you something new, usually something uncomfortable." The human gestured toward the retreating Zephyrian fleet. "They mastered warfare as it existed 3,000 years ago. But warfare didn't stop evolving just because they stopped paying attention." The news of the Zephyrian defeat spread through the galaxy with the efficiency of a particularly determined rumor. Species that had spent centuries cowering before the crystalline empire suddenly found themselves reconsidering their strategic options. The invincible had been vincible. The inevitable had been postponed indefinitely. More importantly, they had been defeated not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through the radical concept of thinking differently about problems that everyone else considered solved. The human pilot, whose name would eventually become legend, though he'd never actually told anyone what it was, found himself in the peculiar position of having accidentally revolutionized galactic military theory. He accepted this development with the same practical resignation he'd shown toward his unscheduled planetfall. "So what happens now?" asked the Verdanian commander, as they watched the Zephyrian flagship limping toward the edge of the system. The human considered this question with the careful attention it deserved. Around them, the galaxy was already beginning to change. The balance of power that had seemed as permanent as physics itself had shifted in the space of a single afternoon. Civilizations that had accepted subjugation as inevitable were remembering that the word inevitable was often just another way of saying nobody's thought of a better idea yet. "Now," he said finally, "things get interesting." The universe, as it turned out, had been waiting quite some time for things to get interesting. The age of predictable conquest was ending, replaced by something far more chaotic, far more creative, and infinitely more dangerous to anyone who assumed that superior technology automatically translated to superior outcome. The Zephyrians had been the strongest, right up until they met someone who didn't particularly care about strength, and was far more interested in being clever.